Okay, well, thank you so much for everyone joining. I'm Gavin Mathis, partner at Prime Movers Lab, leading communications government relations. We have a fantastic panel of deep tech government relations professionals here today just to talk about the midterm elections and everything to expect in the 118th Congress. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things. Please add your questions to the Q&A. We'll leave a little time at the end for about 10 minutes of question and answer. But before we get things started, I just want to turn it over to our panel, do a quick round of intros, maybe just 20, 30 seconds. Megan, maybe we can kick off with you and then Amy and then Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gavin. My name is Megan Williams. I'm the Vice President of Government Relations for Focused Energy, which is a fusion company. I've been there for about 6 months. Prior to that, worked heavily in the energy sector, both here in the United States and abroad, and sustainability. So really have my bread and butter in policy, legislation, both domestically and internationally. So happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. My name is Amy Mehlman. I am the Vice President of Global Affairs and Stakeholder Relations at eSpace Space Company. I've been working in the government affairs space for longer than I actually want to mention, but about 30 years. Probably around the time you guys might know the Telecommunications Act of 1996. I was working on that heavily and then got into space and have been doing space and wireless technology work for many years, both domestically and abroad.
And I'm Paul Stimers. I co-lead the public policy practice group at K&L Gates, a global law firm. I've been with the firm for 20 years, and my practice is focused on disruptive technology, including commercial spaceflight and quantum computing.
So as you can see, it's a pretty diverse group of experts from commercial fusion or fusion energy, commercial space flight, quantum computing, satellite communication. So hopefully we can touch on a lot of these issues during our conversation today. To kind of kick things off, I think probably to start with the midterms last week, kind of what were the kind of the one or two things that surprised you or just key takeaways? Because we were going to have this conversation last Wednesday, and I'm so glad we didn't, because we didn't know anything come this time last week, but now we have a little more clarity. Democrats holding on to the Senate, Republicans being one vote away or one seat away from taking over the majority of the House. Kind of regardless of what happens with the Georgia runoff, kind of have a little more clarity of what the 118th Congress will look like. So we just kind of go around the table again and see, what are those one or two takeaways you guys have from last week and everything that's happened since then?
Yeah, so I think, it's been really busy for politics here in the United States. And I think, I don't think we're all too surprised what has happened. I think, historically speaking, whatever party is in the White House, typically that party tends to lose several seats. However, I think something that did surprise us or surprised me was the fact that, it was such a slim, it's looking like it's going to be such a slim takeover of the House, and the Democrats obviously were able to hold on to the Senate. So it'll be interesting to watch how everything plays out. I think, because it's looking like the Republicans are going to have the House, and with the Democrats in the Senate, I think there's going to have to be a lot of, putting, let bygones be bygones and putting things aside and trying to really work together in order for things to really happen in this next Congress. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Megan said, but I would also add that you've just had Trump sort of double down everything that he's been doing over the last 4 to however many years here. He has elevated, I think, the few folks in Congress that he helped get elected at this point, to make it a little bit more difficult for things, as Megan was saying, to get through in this next Congress. I think, tech policy, science and tech will be a little bit more bipartisan, but some of the bigger issues I think will be harder to get through, given the slimness of margins and given who was actually elected and not elected. So that sort of surprised me as far as, how much influence he may or may not have in this next go round, but those that are the loudest tend to get a little bit more of a stick. So we'll see what happens.
I think it was interesting to see that the red wave that seemed to be building didn't end up cresting very high at all. And I agree that it's going to require a lot of careful maneuvering to get things done in this coming Congress. What I think that will look like is nothing happening and then nothing happening, and then all of a sudden something happening. And so people that want to be part of it when it does happen need to be putting in the work in advance, and need to be playing for a process that is going to look very static until that last minute. And but I do think that's likely to happen. I'll also say I'm somewhat surprised that anybody wants any of the leadership positions that have been races right now, because with such narrow majorities, it's very difficult to corral your caucus, and we've got the wings of the parties staking out their claims, but we've also got the centers of the parties saying, look, if you all make things difficult out there on the wings, we'll just reach across the aisle and get things done with part of the other team. And so that's going to be interesting to watch that dynamic unfold. And with respect to the former president's announcement last night that we're going to see him run again, I think the Republican Party is really going to have an opportunity here to decide whether it wants to see that progress, or whether it really wants to coalesce around some alternatives. And that's going to be a dynamic that we'll be exploring for a while, I think.
Sure. I'm glad you brought that up, Paul. Another thing I wanted to discuss a little bit was just the leadership elections. We saw jockeying this week and plays by Senator Rick Scott for the in the Senate, and then just same thing with the Freedom Caucus in the House. And kind of want to just touch base quickly on that. I mean, first impressions, Paul, you discussed a little bit, but I'd love to get kind of everyone's perspective, kind of what has exactly happened in terms of all these races for leadership positions, and why on earth anyone would want them, as Paul said.
Well, I think, it's we're definitely just going to have to keep watching. I mean, McCarthy, he's got the votes, but he's really going to have to, we're really going to really see how it really plays out later on. At this point, I don't think we don't know really what's going to happen per se, but I think it will be difficult for anyone that's in these leadership positions. And I think they're going to have to figure out how to maneuver, not only within their own parties, but how to maneuver across party lines. So it'll definitely be something to watch for sure.
Yeah, so I would add, to that point, the floor vote is going to be the interesting vote for McCarthy. Certainly he got an overwhelming majority for purposes of, the smaller vote that he got yesterday. I think it was yesterday. He will have to have a majority of the US House. So we'll see how that goes. Deals are going to be made. I think he'll be okay. But regardless, it's still going to be difficult for him or anybody else that's going to be in that position to govern, given the loudest folks that are going to be demanding particular things of him. In the Senate, I think I didn't really have any doubt that McConnell would get the position that he got. He has had and remains very powerful. But again, I think it will be an interesting time for him. It'll be an interesting time for Democrats leading, right? Because they are going to have a lot of seats that are going to be up in 2 years, right? So they're going to have to defend their positions as well over these next 2 years to ensure that they continue progressing as far as, getting additional members in Congress. So if they lose again, it's going to be outs for McConnell from my perspective, but so far so good for him.
I would just add, Mr. McConnell is not in the habit of making categorical statements that are wrong or false. And he had said that he had the votes and would be elected, and indeed he was. With respect to the House side, so as Amy, you mentioned, the key vote does take place when the new House convenes, and the entire House votes for Speaker. So this week's dramatics were just a just a preview. And part of the key dynamic I think that needs to be watched as that unfolds is there are rules and committee assignments and a variety of other campaign tools that Mr. McCarthy and others who are vying for leadership roles will have in terms of what they can promise people who may vote for them. And the other thing is that while this week's vote was a secret vote, that will not be the case for the full House vote. So everybody will be on record on C-SPAN showing who they're voting for. With respect, just briefly, with respect to the kinds of things that can be horse traded, we've got committee memberships. We've got the question of whether or not earmarks will be allowed, and Mr. McCarthy is committed to take them off the table as part of his effort to take the speakership. We have a variety of opportunities with respect to seniority and committee chairmanships, and people who are vying for the speakership or other leadership positions can make their own suggestions to their colleagues as to what they might do if given the power. So it will be interesting to see how that unfolds, because it will impact the structure of the House of Representatives for the coming Congress.
And there's still a lot that needs to be done in the current Congress. I know, we're thinking a lot about what's going to happen in the 118th, but just generally curious how each of you see the next few months playing out with defense authorization bill needs to get done, funding the government past December 16th. So yeah, I'd just love your perspective on kind of how you see, between now and the holidays or before the new Congress comes in. Just it's going to be a really busy time, and a number of our portfolio companies or deep tech companies in general have something in the defense bill that they're very interested in. So I'd love to just get your perspective on what you think the next few months look like.
Yeah, I think the next few months will be busy, and they need to be busy. Typically the lame duck, not too much gets done. However, I think the Democrats have come in, this week with an agenda, and then an agenda to fund the government, to avoid a government shutdown. And they need to go forward and go ahead and pass that NDAA. Like you said, a lot of the deep tech have, some stake in that and so forth. But, things need to get done before, what we think is going to happen is going to happen. The Republicans take over. So overall, I think it's going to be very busy. I think there's legislation there's other legislation like FY23 appropriation, the final version, that should also be passed, but I think that's going to be put on the back burner. There's also several other pieces of legislation that will be put on the back burner. However, the two main pieces I think that will be pushed forward are going to be that NDAA and making sure the government is funded to avoid a government shutdown.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. I think that, a lot of the work on those has already been done. So it'll be a pretty quick, couple of weeks turnaround is my sense. What I don't know is whether, we'll have a CR, or whether we're going to actually have, for example, a defense appropriations bill. It would be a real bummer if we have a CR, keeping us at current funding for, at that point next year, as long as potentially 2 years, right? That would be horrible. I think we need to reflect some of the authorization bills that have already been passed. We can talk about that in a little bit, CHIPS Act, et cetera. But I do think there is an interest from some of the retiring members, for example, to get what they want. This is their last ditch effort to actually get some of their priorities done for their states. So I think there'll be a lot of interest in helping some of those members that actually have been working on some of these things for a long time. So I have some hope.
Yeah, and I'd say, had there been a huge change in the election, there might have been more of an interest in holding things over. But as it stands right now, I think the likelihood is that we'll get an omnibus appropriations package. To begin with, there's a hot war in Europe. We need to fund the Defense Department, and we need to reflect the current NDAA. By the way, that's also a really good reason to pass the NDAA, which has passed every single year for decades. We do have the retiring members. We also, nobody really wants to spend the first bit of 2023 dealing with 2022. And so a clean slate is, I think, something that most people want. Now, just because everybody wants it doesn't mean it can get done, certainly. But I think, like you, I'm optimistic right now that we can get the government funded and get the NDAA done. Leader McCarthy suggested that perhaps the NDAA could be punted into next year. That was surprising to hear him say that, and I think that's not going to turn out to be the case. There's also some indication that Democrats might try to do a debt ceiling limit raise or address it in one way or another. That is not a must do, and that is something that we're not going to hit until sometime, I believe it's in the first quarter of next year. That's likely to prove to be a mess and something that everybody with any kind of government funding or government as a customer should be aware of, and anybody who cares about market stability should be aware of. But it's not clear that will end up being addressed in the way that.
Amy, I'm glad you brought up the just kind of CHIPS and Inflation Reduction Act, and so many of our portfolio companies benefited greatly or could benefit greatly if those bills are funded at or appropriated at the levels that they were authorized. And maybe just take a little bit of time to walk through that and kind of what you expect to see with the appropriations process in the next Congress, and if you think those bills, those two bills would be receive funding at the expected levels, or what you think is going to happen. Just it's a very, even with just only a few new members, it's still a very different Congress than the current one.
Megan, you want to go first?
Sure. So I think we need to first start out looking at, the CHIPS, the IRA. These are two really historical bills that were passed by the administration. I think, although there is going to be a new Congress, I don't think, there's so much going into these bills and so much money that although there is opposition from the GOP, they can't just, come in and say, okay, we're going to repeal these bills. It would virtually be impossible. It would be a very risky political move to do that. I also think that we're not looking at funding for CHIPS particularly. We're not looking at funding, the whole package entirely. Some of that money has already been allocated already. So we're looking at getting, the funding through appropriations for a smaller piece of it. I think it will happen, but I think it'll take a longer time. I think it'll be more of a slow process, but I definitely see these bills moving forward, given what's happening energy-wise, given what's happening Ukraine, Russia, all these pieces play a major part in this. So I really think they're going to move forward, but just maybe at a snail's pace.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of that. And I think that one of the things that we need to factor in is, besides the war in Europe, I think China has a huge impact in this. The other thing is, I think everybody who looks at the CHIPS Act also knows that some of this funding flows back into their states and their districts. So whereas you're looking, if you're sort of looking at it globally, like, oh, we don't want to spend so much money. Yeah, well, that's true. But those that just elected you also want to see something coming back to the district for that vote. So I think, by the way, I would suggest that anybody listening here would actually talk to those new members, talk to some of the folks that may have just come in to let them understand that some of that money is actually very important back home. So I do think it's going to get funded. The level I'm not sure of, but I would just encourage everybody to hold people to what they authorized or what others authorized, regardless of whether they voted for it or not. I think it's really important that the community be energized to make sure that we get funded at the levels they need to be funded at.
All very good points. I would add that the CHIPS Act and IRA are two very different bills. The CHIPS Act is a bipartisan compromise. The IRA is the Democrats' wish list. And I think that the House Republican appropriators are going to be much less interested in funding the IRA than they would be in funding CHIPS. That's not to say that they won't, but they can also, and appropriators of both parties on both sides can also fund them selectively, fully fund some parts of it and defund or reduce funding for other parts. And so that's something that will have to be watched carefully. With respect to CHIPS, even as it was being negotiated and passed, there was concern that while it authorizes large sums of money, those monies might not actually be appropriated. And the concern was that if they weren't, then the bill itself would amount to little more than cheerleading. So there was right from the inception an understanding of the need to pursue full appropriations for CHIPS, and that would be an effort. So we'll see how that shakes out in the coming Congress and in the years beyond, as CHIPS is a multi-year bill. But I think there is a lot of work to be done, both for CHIPS and for IRA to see that funded.
Right. And maybe more specifically, just what do you think kind of like a Republican policy agenda looks like? What does HR 1 look like? For those who don't know, HR 1 tends to be the amalgamation of everything that the party in power wants or kind of represents of their policy platform proposal. It seems like there's been discussion about it being that would open up drilling on federal land. It'd be very energy intensive, and that part of that would be maybe permitting for nuclear reactors, fission reactors, things like that. So there may be a few aspects that are beneficial to deep tech companies, but any insights on what you think the kind of a Republican policy platform looks like? And to be fair, that may be a little too early to discuss, since we don't really know, as you said, we're still waiting on McCarthy's floor vote and what kind of impact the Freedom Caucus could have. So, any thoughts on that?
Paul, please.
Sorry, Megan, are you?
Yeah, go ahead. You can take the first.
Oh, sorry. Well, I think what you put forward is certainly one thought. I think if I were thinking about what is important to them, I think there's certainly from a budget or a fiscal standpoint, something related to keeping our spending in a better place, not having these wish lists or something. Certainly something related to energy, as you mentioned. There are several things that are more or less HR1 than that I think the GOP platform will entail. What HR1 itself says, I'm not so sure. There's no contract with America that I know of, but maybe there is. Maybe Paul, you're looking at me like maybe there is. But certainly there's going to be a drive by that Freedom Caucus to rein in spending and make sure that we have a lot of oversight going. So whether it's COVID, preparedness things, et cetera. There's a lot going on. What HR1 itself says, I think will also be dependent on whether McCarthy ends up, actually being in the position that he's in. So we'll see.
Yeah, definitely a lot to a lot that needs to be nailed down. I've been joking that HR1 might be a subpoena. McCarthy and his team did put out. It's not quite the contract with America, but the Republican commitment to America is a bit of a blueprint. It's a light on details, but it's a bit of a blueprint for where they'd like to go, and it breaks down into 4 categories. First, an economy that's strong. Second, a nation that's safe. Third, a future that's built on freedom. And fourth, a government that's accountable. Pretty broad, but it gives you some idea of, and there's maybe a page of backup for each of those. It gives you some idea of where that team is aiming to take things. Again, as Amy, you've said, whether that team is in fact the team that we end up with and so forth is still very much up in the air.
And you joke about the subpoena, but that is something I want to joke or discuss a little bit too, is how do Republicans use their oversight powers in the House, and what do they go after? I mean, we could see the next 2 years just being, just very focused on investigations into how the administration handled the pandemic and just everything you can possibly imagine. So, I mean, how do you see that playing out, and what role does House oversight or just, some bomb throwers in the House have in terms of setting the agenda for the next 2 years?
Yeah, I think, as far as, some of these investigative committees and things, there's definitely going to be quite a few of them. I mean, they have been threatening them all along over COVID, even over some of the science funding. There's going to be scrutiny over that and looking into where, some of that funding is going. I think, it doesn't have to be this way, but I think it is going to go in the direction of, hey, everything that the Democrats did, and they were, poking at us, let's turn that back around and do it tenfold. And I really do see that happening, unfortunately. But I think they're also going to have to kind of get a tighter grip around that, because there's so many other things that need to be accomplished and done. So while I see these committees being formed and, them diving deep in, I think, there's going to have to be some discussions even within the party that say, we need to really look at what we're doing and how we're doing it and the agendas that we're setting.
Yeah, look, I would agree again with everything Megan's saying, but so if you look at what they need to do, the GOP needs to do in the House to set up the next 2 years, right? Make sure that they have not only the House, maybe the Senate and the presidency. You got to look at, okay, what are we going to make America look resilient? What is our agenda going to be? We're going to make sure that we're not, succumbing to China. We're going to be first in everything. We've got to make sure that we're prepared. What happened during the pandemic? Did something happen in a lab in China that shouldn't have happened and got out because we were, too lax? Why didn't we see it sooner? What did Fauci do? Bring him up. And then there's going to be, oversight, as Megan said, on things like universal service funding, right? I mean, everything that has anything to do with too much spending, potentially, whether you believe that's right or not. I think they're going to be looking at that and picking some of the spending apart. So yes, as Megan said, they're going to turn it around and make sure that they scrutinize what they feel like they need to scrutinize to ensure that their agenda is set up appropriately for the next 2 years.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a balance, right, between attack ads and governing. I made a list of the things that I think are potential topics for investigation, and this is a non-exclusive list, but it includes the Biden family and its ties to foreign benefactors, the handling of the pandemic, the disastrous Afghanistan pullout, the politicization of the Department of Justice and the FBI, immigration and border security, education and parents' rights, election integrity, wokeism wherever it may be found. And that's, again, we're just getting warmed up. All of those things will be fair game as far as the Republicans are concerned. And so the trick again will be having enough of that to make a case that things have gone wrong, but balancing it with the ability to make a case that you can do it better. And demonstrating the ability to govern. The overarching message for all of this is also going to be, as noted, China. every single committee is going to have China as part of its jurisdiction and part of its mandate. If you're, if you're the small business committee, you're going to be talking about China. If you're the science, space and technology committee, you're going to be talking about China. If you're the natural resources committee, the judiciary committee, you're going to be talking about China. Plus, if that were not enough China, there's going to be a special committee on China. So that's definitely going to be an important aspect. And then it's not going to just be investigations of and oversight of the administration. There's going to be a lot of focus on corporations in the United States, and especially on technology corporations, and especially on the corporations like Facebook, Meta, et cetera, that have some impact on the public discourse. So it's going to be a very busy time for large corporations as they either try to stay under the radar or try to get back under the radar to the extent that it's possible.
On the committee kind of makeup, or maybe there's some assumptions being made here, but presumably Roger Wicker moves off of Senate Commerce, Science, Transportation to be the ranking member on Armed Services, which leaves room for Ted Cruz to come in and take over that chairmanship, which could be kind of interesting. And then on the House side, Eddie Bernice Johnson is retiring, so there's a little bit of a race for House Science Committee there. I mean, just generally curious about how you see this, these new leaders coming into these chairmanships and what that means for science funding, science priorities, and kind of the work they've done on subcommittees, and if that has any indication of priorities for those committees in the new Congress.
Yeah, so you have a bunch of personalities coming to these committees. I think as far as, pertaining to science funding, again, I'm gonna, I keep restating this. I think science fund, it's gonna get funded. Science is going to get funded. However, it's just going to be slower. There's going to be more scrutiny over it. I think NSF is going to have a harder time, getting funding. But I think with the committees, we'll have to see how it plays out, because I think, all of these potential chairs and ranking members that are going to come in, they're going to come in with, their own agendas. Every person that you named, Gavin, they have a huge personality with a set agenda. So I think that, if they're going to come in, try and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to look at it. But I also think they're going to realize, like, we're not going to get everything done if we don't work across that aisle. So it's going to be a balancing act. We're going to have to kind of see how everything plays out. But as far as funding goes, I think things are going to be funded. Again, it's just going to be a slow process, and things are going to, there's going to be a magnifying glass on everything.
Yeah, I would agree. I think what's interesting, you have the appropriators and the authorizers. So two very different things, right? You have some changes in the appropriation side of it as well. So you have Kay Granger coming in from the Defense Appropriations Ranking position, very supportive of science and tech funding from the defense sort of hawkish side of things. Her at the helm, I think, is great for science and tech funding, space as well, for those who are interested in that, aerospace more generally. And then on the Senate side, I think Patty Murray, is also very supportive of that as well. So it'll be interesting. It'll be a different dynamic. But I think, again, from the science and tech perspective, I think it's not a bad slate. Authorizing maybe a little bit different. I mean, Frank Lucas on the science side is definitely very supportive, and he's worked across the aisle very, very well on the CHIPS Act, et cetera, helped write it. On the Senate side with Ted Cruz, that'll be interesting. I mean, I think he's sort of straddles, the issues with struggling with, how do I balance that with the national priorities or national interests that he has as far as potential, presidential run or something like that. So, it'll be interesting how he governs from the rankings position. But hopefully for space, science, and tech, he'll be very supportive. But we should look toward appropriations to really drive some of the things that we're interested in. It'll be interesting, Paul. I'd love your opinion on how that plays out on the House side, given the priorities and the earmarks that you mentioned before.
Well, that's certainly going to be interesting. What I'm most intrigued by at the moment actually is long ago Washington had Scoop Jackson and Warren Magnuson, and they were twin titans that basically the rule that they had was one for us, one for you, with us being Washington State and you being the rest of the nation. And it was an incredibly powerful position for the state of Washington to be in. Well, now we've got Patty Murray as helming appropriations, and Maria Cantwell helming Senate Commerce. And if as a kicker, just to round things out, we'll have Kathy McMorris Rogers leading Energy and Commerce on the House side. So once again, you've got a state that is poised to really make a play. And I think both Chair Cantwell and Chairwoman Murray are going to be incredibly active, very forward-leaning. Certainly, Chair Cantwell has been over the last years of her chairship. On the with Senator Cruz coming in, he's demonstrated over time that he can work in a bipartisan manner. He's got, I think, solid working relationships with Chair Cantwell and her team. It will be interesting to see what develops in terms of a presidential campaign, et cetera. On the House side, I agree. Chairman Lucas has been a very bipartisan, very engaged ranking member. Interestingly, one of the aspects of science funding that's going to shift most, I think, and science in general, science policy in general, that's going to shift most is the climate aspect. I think we're going to see a shift away from climate science funding and away from climate science policy. But Mr. Lucas cares a great deal about weather. And so the difference between climate and weather is a fairly fine line. And so we may not see quite as much, at least on the authorizing side, quite as much of a change as might otherwise have been the case. There are a number of subcommittee changes that will also take place on the House side. Not necessarily always easy to tell what that's going to look like, because the world is unjust. The Science Committee is not necessarily everybody's first choice. And so as things move around on more desirable committees, spots may open up and things will change a fair amount, at least potentially. And we sometimes see freshmen taking subcommittee chairmanships and things like that. So I think early yet to see exactly how that'll all shake out. The one other thing that I will say is that on the House side, especially, the Science Committee has a lot of jurisdictional fights that it has to defend versus other committees. So the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, sometimes try to poach what the Science Committee sees as its rightful jurisdiction. I think Chairman Lucas will vigorously defend the committee's jurisdiction. And I think that's in general a good thing for science when the committee does that.
I think everyone's mentioned a few names here, but at PML, we love to see people who have a strong scientific background get elected to Congress, or people who worked in research or in think tanks or in research labs, like a Bill Foster was a physicist. I mean, he was reelected. Elaine Larish, who lost, who represents Virginia, the kind of Norfolk area. She was a nuclear engineer for the Navy for a long time. And just generally curious, do you see any kind of individual changes, new members, or just particular advocates for the scientific community kind of standing out in the next Congress, or any personalities besides the ones we've just mentioned?
I think from, I'll take it more from a fusion science perspective. There are several members that stand out. Congressman Beyer here from Virginia. You mentioned Representative Bill Foster. There's, Representative Trahan from Massachusetts. These are all, and I'm just naming a few, there's at least 20 members I can point out that are very big on science, fusion science, and energy in general, and ways to move forward. So to answer your question more concretely, yes, there are a lot of members that I think could be put in these positions.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo Megan, but I would also say that more generally, I don't think we're dealt a bad deal at the moment. I think we actually have some members that are already being put in place that are very supportive. It'd be nice to have a little bit more people that are well versed in particular technologies that may be on the margins of a normal tech person. Like space is different than somebody, a software company. So that would be nice to get more of that elected, and have leadership in particular areas of the country that are targets for some of this tech innovation. But I think we're dealt with a good set of folks on these committees already.
Yeah, and I think I very much agree with that. One of the things that again, because the membership in particular of the Science Committee is in flux, it's important that the chairman recruit well. And this is something that former Chairman Lamar Smith did. He would really aggressively go out to the new members and pick the people that he wanted on his committee and sell them on it. And I think Mr. Lucas watched that happen, saw that it yielded good results, and I hope that we can expect from him some of that as well. I also note that we have a very strong staff on the Science Committee, on the Senate Commerce Committee as well, and some of the other committees that deal with science. And I think as long as members are willing to listen to that professional staff, and are also, the new members hiring good staff with their own, that's where there's going to be the opportunity to do a deep dive into some of the technology backing, and the members just need to listen, pay attention, and absorb what they're being told by their staff.
Yeah, I'm just going to add to that real quick. That I would also agree with that for the Appropriations Committee too. There is that staff tends to roll over in a meaningful way. I mean, I know staffers that have been there for 20 years, and it's incredibly important because you have the institutional knowledge of some of these programs that, are hard to pick apart. So, that's very, very helpful.
And Amy, you mentioned some of your global travels earlier. And Megan, I mean, Focus Energy has a large presence or a substantial presence in Germany. And I kind of love to get your perspectives from your colleagues, your travels, just from like a global perspective, what they've kind of said about our elections. They think we're just absolutely crazy the way we've done this, or how things are playing out here with, how we're governing, and kind of as the presidential election really is kicking off with Trump's announcement on Monday. Just generally curious about what you're hearing from colleagues and your travels abroad.
Yeah, absolutely. From Focus Energy on, particularly on the German side, yeah, everyone's watching. We're the talk of the town, the talk of the country. But yeah, I mean, in general, I think across the board, the world watches the United States, and the United States it sets the precedence of how things play out in other countries. Sometimes great, and sometimes, unfortunately, it goes that way. They are very interested in what happens, because whatever happens, that also helps them, set their legislation, or, they are like, okay, well, let's revamp. Not only Germany, but also some of these other countries. I've worked, in the Nordic countries as well. And particularly when we're looking at climate change, sustainability, the Green Deal, and, energy, it's particularly Europe, they're very keen on getting this done, and getting this done fast. They have, agendas set with very aggressive agendas saying like, look, we're going to be carbon neutral by this time. We're going to put these deals in place. And because I think the way the United States has played things out, they're like, okay, well, they're doing that over there. That's great, but we need to make these steps too. So in a way, I think that some of these countries are a step ahead of us, particularly when we're looking at sustainability and climate and energy. And I think that's interesting because if you look at the way their governments function, one, they have like 5, 6 parties. And then 2, they have, their government backs whatever they're trying to do. So if they're like, okay, we have an agenda of being carbon neutral by 2030, okay, this is what we're going to do, and they execute it. So I think, while United States wants to be first and here, first and there, we also need to turn around and look at what others are doing, and say, okay, well, that's working over here. Maybe we should try that. So I'll stop there because I'll keep going on and on, but yeah.
Well, more generally, I think if you're in, for example, the UK, you think our process looks great.
Yeah, sure.
So I think it depends where you are more generally. I think Megan's right. Everybody's watching. How people react is very different. So, if you are in Europe, everybody has a little bit of a geopolitical different situation, right? So China is going to be different from Russia. That's going to be different from Africa and Europe. So Europe, I think Megan's right. They're looking for us from a reactionary standpoint, who's going to be, working on the Green New Deal or those types of things. I think they are ahead of us in Asia Pacific and in the Middle East, for example, and Africa too. Africa's looking for, okay, what's investment going to look like, right? Middle East and Europe are looking at, what's trade going to look like? How is the policy going to change? I know we have Biden, but is there anything that the Republicans are going to do now in Congress that's going to change that? And I think everybody's looking at, pandemic response and things like that, and how things will change from a US perspective, because that also is driving lots of policy in different places as well. And certainly the funding that's going into some of these medicines, et cetera, vaccinations, that's also something that people are heavily watching. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that we could talk about, but I think it really just depends where you are in the world. And I've heard lots of different things over the last couple of weeks in the various places that I've gone. But everybody is watching.
Yeah.
I
Paul,
think,
anything to add? Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Or just anything to add there?
No, I was just going to say, I think that covers it pretty well.
Quick question from Twitter. And a reminder to everyone, please, drop your questions in the Q&A. We'd have one that came in a little ahead of the webinar. What's the one policy change that if you could snap your fingers and make that happen, what would be that would have the biggest impact for your industry or deep tech in general? What would it be?
I think from the fusion perspective, public-private partnerships, if I could snap my fingers and say, hey, DOE fund all these great fusion companies, I think it would be excellent, because their fusion, I'm just going to do a quick fusion plug here. Fusion is really at the cusp, and if we can commercialize it, all this discussion about energy and energy policy, we really could get there. So if I could snap my fingers and say, hey, DOE, hey, Congress, we need more funding and we need it now, that would be my pick.
Well, I'm going to give Megan an amen on that. That's the first thing. But honestly, if there was one wish I had for this Congress, it would be some real bipartisan action. It is hard to get anything done, and policy actually needs to happen. Appropriations, even though you do a CR or get some of this funding that we're talking about, unless you have the authorization to go along with it, it's going to be hard to deal with some of these policy matters coming down the pike. So if I could wish for anything, it'd be some bipartisan action.
Well, I will appropriate both of your wishes and add my own. I would like to see the government become a better customer, and better at being a customer, faster and more streamlined acquisition processes, on-ramps for the private sector. And this is something that across all of our innovative clients, they say, look, if you want us to be helpful, if you, the federal government, want to take advantage of this extraordinary, innovative private sector that we have, that's the way that we're going to compete with the top-down economy of China, you need to make it easy for us to help you. And so you know, you can have us help you with stuff like that, and we're happy to do that. But it would be better for the country, for the government, just to start getting better at being a customer and shorten acquisition times, streamline the processes, and so I think that fits pretty well, certainly with Megan, with what you were saying about public-private partnerships as well.
Yeah, you know, Gavin, I'm gonna interject one thing, because I think it's something that we haven't talked about, and maybe we could go around the horn and talk about this as well. Because you mentioned the government and being a good partner, CFIUS and reverse CFIUS is something that I think is going to be a big deal coming up. Certainly it sort of stems from China, but other countries. And I think from an investment standpoint, we all want to make sure that we are not limited necessarily in what we do and how we conduct our business. But you know, we also depend on government funding. So this will be a really, really interesting time coming up this next couple of years. I'd be interested in what the other panelists have to say on this, but from, you know, some of the folks that Gavin, your group deals with, I think this will be a very interesting thing for them to take a look at and ensure that people are talking to their members of Congress if they have an interest.
It's a very good point. You kind of stole one of my last questions, which was
Sorry.
exactly, no, I was so glad you did. Yeah, it was just general role kind of, or trying to pull in some timely elements with, you know, President Biden's, you know, remarks on, or meeting with President Xi, and, you know, what does research security and kind of semiconductor supply chains look like, and how do, you know, do a lot of those functions kind of, those supply chains just move to North America in terms of battery manufacturing, semiconductors, chips, everything. But yeah, I'll allow Paul and Megan your take on that too.
Yeah, these are all important. I mean, we've seen, you know, what has happened in the last couple of years with the shortage in chips and, you know, building of semiconductors. I think, yeah, it's something we need to really look at hard, because I think in the next couple of years, it's only going to get worse. We're going to need more chips with, you know, we're going to need more building of the semiconductors, and really wherever these can be built, whether it's here in the United States, that is where everything is going to be kind of channeled. I think in the past, you know, part of the reason why, you know, we're having such a shortage on these things is because, you know, we're not making them. We're not, you know, producing enough. And we're looking at China and some of these other places to do it for us. And so I think we're really going to have to kind of look inward and see what we can do as a country to get ahead of this.
I'd say, Amy, thank you for raising CFIUS. I'd say that CFIUS export controls and immigration are all related. And when I'm talking about immigration, it's sort of a high value. How do we bring in people who would be the chief technology officer while preventing folks who are coming in just to bring things back to their country and compete with us there? And in each case, I think we're dealing with structures that were created for a world in which if it didn't happen in the United States, it wasn't going to happen. And so we had a situation where we were trying to hermetically seal ourselves off from the rest of the world. Now, if we try to do that, it'll just happen elsewhere without us. And so trying to balance the very legitimate national security needs that those are intended to address with the actual outcomes is a challenge, and one that I would very much like to see, and that my clients would very much like to see Congress really wrestle with.
And maybe last question, you know, with President Trump announcing this week, presidential race is off and running, and how do you kind of see the presidential race impacting Congress's ability to get anything done over the next couple of years? I mean, you're going to have some senators and House members throw their hat in the ring, and just the general politics of a presidential race, you know, impacting all the kind of very the nitty gritty science and policy that we care about. I mean, love everyone's perspectives.
Yeah, I think, it'll be interesting. I think people are already viewing, looking at 2024. I mean, obviously Trump threw in his hat yesterday. You had, people like Mike Pence say, he's prayerfully considering. So I think everyone's going to be watching it. I think, things are going to have to get done in Congress. We wouldn't want to do nothing Congress. So, things are going to have to get done, but definitely I think the way things get done, particularly with some of these players that want to throw their hats in the game, we're going to kind of see some shifting going on.
Yeah, so I think getting back to the oversight piece, I think as we get closer toward, the actual election, the primary times, I think that you'll see some heavy oversight going on. I think it'll start immediately, but I do think that, it'll galvanize towards some of those dates. And then, as you mentioned, there may be some members of Congress running. So if you have Ted Cruz, for example, running, how does that hamper or help some of the things that he's doing in the committee? That, we'll wait to see. I don't know if Rick Scott will get in. So there may be some ramifications to actually governing at the times that people are running. But I think oversight is the big piece of this.
Yeah, I'll just add, the election could hardly have gone worse for Donald Trump, and it could hardly have gone better for Ron DeSantis and for Joe Biden. I think DeSantis is the current leader in the Republican PAC. The Republican PAC will grow substantially. Megan, you mentioned Mr. Pence and others. We're seeing Mr. Pompeo might throw his hat in the ring. There's a number of candidates who will emerge in the coming months. On the Democratic side, as we headed into the election, there was increasing rumbles that maybe it was time for President Biden to make way for somebody else in the next term. We've heard a lot less of that since last Tuesday, and that doesn't mean that those questions have gone away, but they've gone back underground. And it will be interesting to see within the Democratic Party how they handle having a toweringly presumptive nominee in the person of the sitting president of the United States, a backup presumptive nominee in the person of Vice President Harris, and a bunch of people who really, really want the job. And so there's a lot of potential energy on the Democratic side to match the already joined battle on the Republican side.
It's a great last point, and thank you all. Just in closing, just fantastic panel. You guys were amazing. And for those watching, if you want to watch the whole thing again, we'll have this up on our YouTube channel later this week. And please subscribe to our blog or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn as we just for more content like this. But I just want to thank everyone again, and thank you for those who joined us.
Thank you
For having us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.